We said natural allies don't need enemies to unite. So the question is, what do they need? Over here, most diplomats talk about one thing: shared values. These are things India and the United States have in common, like democracy or rule of law or social diversity. In the last 2 decades, we've heard a lot of this from presidents, from diplomats, and from senators. Take a look.
Partnership between the United States and India has deep and sturdy roots in the values we share.
The United States has an enormous fondness for India, partly because there's so many Indian Americans, and because of the shared values that we have.
Our two nations are united by shared values of democracy, respect for individual rights, and a shared commitment to freedom.
One of those additional elements are the values that we share, the values that are common to American democracy and to Indian democracy.
That was in the last 2 decades. But before that, things weren't so rosy. India's relationship with the US was colored by the Cold War. Washington had a strict policy then. Are you with us or against us? India refused to play that game. As a result, relations suffered. During this period, two events stand out. One was the 1971 war. India intervened to end Pakistan's crackdown in present-day Bangladesh. The Soviets supported us. Britain and France were indifferent. But the US actively opposed us. Then President Richard Nixon supported Pakistan. He even deployed an aircraft carrier in the Indian Ocean to intimidate New Delhi. Why? Because Islamabad was mediating between the US and China. They needed Pakistan's support. So they went against India. The second instance was also in the same decade. The year was 1974. India conducted its first tests in 1974, first nuclear tests. And how did the US respond? With sanctions. The Americans hampered India's space and defense programs. Even after the Cold War, things were slow to change. In 1998, India tested another nuclear device. The Americans sanctioned again. They stopped India from securing foreign aid and loans. So the 20th century, you could say, was a lost opportunity for both the countries. India and the US were effectively rivals. Washington moved closer and closer to Pakistan in this period, so New Delhi found comfort in Moscow. So what has changed between now and then? How did we go from sanctions to state visits? Well, relations really began to improve. In the 1990s, India had opened up its economy by then, and Pakistan was less important since the Soviets were out of Afghanistan. So Washington tried to reset things. Plus, remember, the Cold War was over. The US did not have to worry about the Soviet Union. The 1998 sanctions were a setback, but a brief one, because the next year, Kargil happened. The whole world knew what Pakistan was doing. They saw Pakistan as the aggressor. So then President Bill Clinton summoned Pakistan's Nawaz Sharif. He asked Sharif to withdraw his soldiers. It was a big moment in India-US relations. In the year 2000, Clinton also visited India. It was the first visit by an American president since 1978. This was Clinton's message to the Indian Parliament. Listen to this.
So we want India to be strong, to be secure, to be united, to be a force for a safer, more prosperous, more democratic world.
His successor, George Bush, lifted the sanctions. Under Bush, we also signed the nuclear deal. So the ghosts of 1974 and 1998 were forgotten. But in the last decade, things have really picked up pace. It's not a slow reset anymore, and two reasons have contributed to that. One is the rise of China. The US knows very well what Beijing is trying to do here, to replace them as the leading power in the world. That's what China is trying to do. They also know what India brings to the table, an alternative to China in Asian dominance, sort of like a bulwark. The second reason is Pakistan's diminishing importance. Like in the 1990s, Washington has no interest in Afghanistan. So once again, Pakistan is becoming irrelevant. The question now is what comes next? The US-India relationship cannot be defined in opposition to something. In this case, it's China. The relationship must be broad. It must be evolving. I know idealism does not have a place in foreign policy, but Biden and Modi have a real shot here. This is a relationship that could define the next 100 years, that could actually help people all over the world. But are the leaders ready for that? Prime Minister Modi seems to be game. He spoke to US media ahead of the trip. He said there is, quote unquote, unprecedented trust between India and the US. He also underlined his foreign policy goal. Listen to this. Let me be clear that we do not see India as supplanting any country. We see this process as India gaining its rightful position in the world. That's what the Indian Prime Minister said. Simply put, India's time has come. It's something Bill Clinton had already accepted in the year 2000. It's time for Joe Biden to do the same. Over in China, there is a big problem. Their economy is stalled. It was speeding on the highway for most of the last decades, but now the engine has broken down. So what is Beijing doing? Well, today their central bank decided to cut 2 interest rates for the 1-year loan and for the 5-year loan. Now, China is hoping that this will kickstart their economy. How does that work? Time for a quick lesson. We know that banks charge interest on loans. But who fixes that interest? Who decides how much a bank will charge? That's the central bank of the country. If they cut interest rates, then loans become cheaper, meaning people can borrow and spend more, which is good for the economy. If they hike interest rates, if the central bank hikes interest rates, loans become more expensive. So there is less borrowing and consequently there is less spending, which is bad for the economy. Now, China is trying the first strategy. They're cutting interest rates to boost loans and spending. By how much? 10 basis points. This is the first interest cut by China in 10 months. The last one was after the disastrous zero COVID lockdowns. Now, it's an interesting situation. In the Western world, central banks are hiking interest rates because their biggest problem is inflation. But China's problem is the opposite. The economy is so bad that people are not spending any money. Prices are not going up. They're bottoming out. Will the rate cut solve that issue? The markets are not too confident. Both Hong Kong and Shanghai indices were trading in the red. It seems investors wanted a bigger rate cut. Plus, rate cuts are not really a quick fix. In China, they take a long time to trickle down. Take the big companies. They negotiate all their loans in one go over a few weeks. So the new interest may not apply to them. Same with home buyers. The mortgages are tweaked in the month of January. Right now, we're in the month of June. So don't expect radical changes. Let's also look at the larger picture. What's happening to China's economy? I'll show you 3 indicators. 3 indicators that should sum things up. First is industrial production. Industrial production increased by 5.6% in the month of April. But the very next month, in the month of May, it was down to 3.5%, which means the momentum has disappeared. The second indicator is exports. What China sells to the rest of the world. What do they export? That fell to 7.5% in the month of May. Experts had predicted a 0.4% decline. The actual fall was 7.5%. Tells you how bad the situation is. Finally, the third indicator, and that is jobs. China's youth unemployment is at a record high. It was more than 20% in the month of May. So if you take 5 Chinese youth in the age of 16 to 24, one of them doesn't have a job. Put all these indicators together, and what do you get? A slowdown. Goldman Sachs has cut the GDP forecast for China. Their first estimate was 6%. Their new one is 5.4%. Remember, this is China we're talking about. They were growing double digits in the first decade of the century. So what happened to them? Well, experts blame multiple reasons for the slowdown. For example, the type of growth, the growth model that the Chinese followed, build, build, and build. That strategy works in the short term, but in the long term, you need innovation, you need reform. Both have eluded China. They're left with ghost buildings and highways to nowhere. Another reason is Xi Jinping's policies. A big part of China's booming growth was foreign investment. Multinational companies built facilities in China. They put money in China. It was called the factory of the world. But President Xi Jinping has scared these corporates away. He's cracked down on everything, has spooked multinationals. Many MNCs are leaving. Seems like Xi has realized this finally. He met with 2 titans of the corporate world recently, Elon Musk and Bill Gates. It could be an attempt to satisfy foreign investors. But my point is, this is going to be a massive challenge after what you've been doing so far. If this is just a phase of slowdown, China may escape. Perhaps things will get better in the second half of the year. But if it's a structural problem, it will be much more difficult to handle. We'll have to wait and see how this plays out. So 25 years ago, India was under US sanctions. Today, Washington is New Delhi's largest trading partner. It sounds like a drastic turn of events, but it's not really an unexpected one. You see, India-US ties are growing rapidly. At the heart of this is the economic partnership and trade. And Prime Minister Modi's visit comes at a crucial time. As I mentioned, the US is India's largest trading partner. Bilateral trade rose to $191 billion. Compare that to 2021, it was around $80 billion. In fact, India-US trade has surged by nearly 800% between 1999 and 2019. Imagine that, 800% rise. It just shows how far things have come between the two countries. And make no mistake, this is a strategic relationship. Both countries have their own agenda. They want to reduce their dependence on China. That's one of the reasons why they're together. And this cooperation becomes crucial. It's being driven by groupings like the Quad and the I2U2. The Quad has India, the US, Australia, and Japan, 4 members. I2U2 has India, Israel, that's I2, and the US and UAE, that's U2. Now, these are crucial forums for joint investments and new initiatives. Plus, there are other bilateral investments, a mammoth Boeing aircraft deal, defense deals, the crucial chip partnership. You see, chips are key to power in the 21st century. So India is pushing itself as an alternative to China. New Delhi wants to boost semiconductor manufacturing. And this is a plan that the US supports. It wants to help India. It wants to expand cooperation in emerging technologies like supercomputing and, of course, semiconductors. The idea is quite simple. Build a resilient global supply chain and reduce dependence on China. It's an ambitious goal, but one that could define our partnership. So to sum it up, bilateral trade is at a record high, investments and deals are pouring in, and we are staring at a tech partnership. It sounds almost perfect. But there are still a few issues. Even with all this, India-US trade ties are not where they should be. There is still some friction there. The US does not like India's protectionist policies, especially in terms of foreign investment. On the other hand, India says that the US is not accommodating enough. It doesn't really consider the fact that India is still a developing country. So there are differences. What is the solution? One could be the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or the IPEF. The US could ask India to join the trade pillar. Now let me give you some background. The IPEF was launched by the Americans in May last year. And it has 4 pillars: trade, supply chains, clean economy, and fair economy. Now, India has joined 3 pillars, but it hasn't joined the 4th one, that is trade. So Washington may want India to join it. Which brings us to the free trade agreement. There was a lot of buzz around this, but it has now fizzled out, it seems. Both India and the US have ruled out any trade deals, so an FTA may not be on the table. The other issue is trade disputes at the WTO. That's the World Trade Organization. Reports suggest that India and the US are looking at an out-of-court settlement. What does that mean? Well, the WTO is a global trade body. Currently, India and the US have 7 trade disputes there. Now, reports say they want to settle these disputes outside the court, which could mean a voluntary withdrawal of some of these cases, some or all of them. And Prime Minister Modi's visit could see a breakthrough there. Both India and the US want to reach a $500 billion mark in trade. It's a bold goal, but it's not impossible. The potential is limitless. What we need is bolder economic agendas, one that is focused on trade and technology. If India and the US want to emerge as a force, as a bulwark against China, they must strengthen their economic relationship, iron out the outstanding issues, and focus on the positives. And now to the biggest story from India. Indian aviation is soaring to new heights. In February, Air India broke all records. It signed a mammoth deal with Airbus and Boeing, a deal to buy 470 planes. And now it's Indigo's turn. Indigo has ordered 500 jets from Airbus. It's the biggest ever plane deal in history anywhere in the world.
Today it's my pleasure and my honor actually to announce that Indigo has concluded with Airbus the next fleet purchase in a magnitude of 500 new aircraft in the Airbus 320 family. An enormous milestone. To our knowledge and our recollection, no one has ever ordered an order of this magnitude, and it speaks to the potential of Indian aviation and the ambitions which Indigo is having.
I think what we see happening here today, and I was said before, speaks very highly of what's happening in India, the growth, the development, but also the one of aviation. Incredible growth for aviation, the willingness to fly. Indigo has been a fantastic opportunity for Indian people to fly for the first time.
Like they said, it's the story of India's aviation boom. But more about the deal first. Airbus is a French plane maker. In fact, it is one of Europe's biggest aerospace giants. Indigo has placed an order for 500 of their planes. This was revealed at the Paris Air Show. Indigo is buying the narrow-body A320 aircraft. The deal is worth over $50 billion. The planes will be delivered between 2030 and 2035. This is the single biggest purchase in aviation history, like I said, anywhere in the world. So what is Indigo's plan with this order? Indigo, the company, was founded in the year 2006. Right now, it is India's top airline. The domestic carrier has a market share of more than 61%. That is more than half of the country's market. So clearly, Indigo is a dominant force, and it is planning ahead to remain a dominant force. The purchase has two main goals. One, Indigo wants to keep its fleet size steady. What does that mean? Well, planes have a shelf life, like all things. So even if Indigo retires 100 planes, say by 2030, it wants new aircraft to keep its fleet constant. That's one goal. The second goal is that Indigo wants to expand its operations. Demand for air travel is booming in India, and Indigo wants to capitalize on that. It is introducing new international routes and doubling capacity to meet this demand. Talk about flying the extra mile. By the end of the decade, Indigo wants to double in size and scale as an airline, which brings us to India's aviation sector. New Delhi is on the cusp of an aviation boom. Currently, it's the world's third largest aviation market. It has more than 378 million passengers. But India is aiming higher. India wants to be the world's biggest aviation market, surpassing the likes of the United States and China. So what is New Delhi doing to support this? Well, there's a flurry of investments, new airports, new aircraft, and new infrastructure. Air travel is booming, and New Delhi wants to keep up with that. Let me also give you a recent example. In the month of April, domestic air traffic in India hit a record high. Nearly 500 million passengers flew on the same day. Imagine that, 500 million. This is the demand I was talking about, and this is the demand that airlines want to capitalize on. You see, the pandemic was a terrible time for aviation. Revenue fell to an all-time low. The jet market, too, was dealt a blow. But now, with air travel up and about again, plane makers are looking at new markets, markets like India. They want to cater to the world's largest population. In the month of February, Air India signed a mega jet deal. It involved both Boeing and Airbus, 470 aircraft. And now it's Indigo and Airbus, 500 new planes. It looks like plane makers have finally realized India's potential, and they're vying for a piece of its growth story. And now let's turn our attention to Jenin, a city in the northern West Bank, home to over 300,000 people, also a scene of human suffering. There's been regular violence between Israelis and Palestinians here, but yesterday it witnessed one of West Bank's fiercest clashes. Israeli forces stormed Jenin's refugee camp. They fired live ammunition, stun grenades, and toxic gas. They used helicopter gunships for the first time in decades. 5 Palestinians were killed, many others were injured. What led to this attack? What is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's strategy, and how is the world reacting to these developments? Our next report tells you.
Heavy gunfire, a rain of explosive devices, smoke billowing from buildings, burning tires on the ground. These scenes are from Jenin, a violence-struck city in northern West Bank, which witnessed a large-scale clash yesterday, one of the West Bank's fiercest ever. What led to this clash? Before dawn, undercover Israeli troops entered Jenin's refugee camp, targeting the home of a Palestinian member of Hamas, which has been designated a terrorist organization by Israel. Following this, Palestinian terrorists targeted Israeli troop transport. Explosives were hurled at soldiers from multiple directions, so Israeli forces reacted. They fired live ammunition, stun grenades, and toxic gas. A combat helicopter was used to repel gunmen, in a first in 2 decades. Meanwhile, soldiers were extracted from troop transport. This resulted in one of the most intense West Bank firefights. It went on for hours. The result? 5 Palestinians, including a child, dead, over 90 civilians wounded, and 7 Israeli soldiers injured. What does the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have to say about it? He has applauded the efforts of his forces, saying that the soldiers were incredibly impressive. For Netanyahu, this attack was a message to terror forces, a crackdown on terrorism. Listen in.
We strike terrorism with might and determination. Over the past few months, we have assassinated and detained a record number of terrorists. This was the case also yesterday during an operation in Jenin. Our forces eliminated several terrorists, arrested others.
But many don't see it that way, especially as tensions have been on the rise in the West Bank. And Netanyahu's government is the most right-wing in Israeli history, so many have condemned Israel's actions. Listen in to what the UN has to say.
The Secretary General shares the views of his special coordinator, Tor Venesland, who said just over the past hour that he was deeply concerned by today's events in Jenin following an Israeli security forces operation and the ensuing exchange of fire, which resulted in 5 Palestinians killed, including a child, and some 60 Palestinians and 7 Israeli forces wounded, at the very least. I believe those numbers are going up as we speak. Such escalations threaten to plunge the region deeper into a deadly crisis. Mr. Venesland said that all sides must refrain from actions that would further escalate the situation and take steps to re-engage on a political path.
Iran and neighboring Jordan have also condemned the raid on Jenin. Jordan warned of an ongoing cycle of violence and stressed the need to halt Israel's continuous incursions into Palestinian cities. Meanwhile, Iran said Israel's criminal attacks are intensifying, calling it a clear example of organized crime and state terrorism. Hamas too has condemned the Jenin raid and praised the resistance. No shocker there. But listen in.
The Zionist occupation carried out a crime in Jenin through the raid using tanks and planes and by killing martyrs in this Zionist occupation against the camp. It shows that the resistance still exists in all West Bank cities, and the threats by the occupation of a military operation will not stop the resistance in the West Bank.
So while Israel stands its ground, with big plans to crack down on terrorism, and Palestinian forces remain undeterred, Palestinians continue to bury their dead, with a devastating casualty toll on the rise.
And finally, some sobering news. The Himalayan glaciers are dying. They may lose 75% of their ice by the end of this century. Let me repeat that. 3/4 of the Himalayan glacier could melt by the end of 2100. And this will put about 2 billion people at risk. That's a quarter of humanity. These are the findings of a new report. Here's more.
The Himalayas, the tallest mountain range in the world. They connect to a lot of other ranges, like the Hindu Kush, Karakoram, and Pamirs. Together, these linking ranges are the roof of the world. This great range is sometimes referred to as the Hindu Kush Himalayas. These mountain ranges contain great peaks, like Mount Everest, K2, and Kanchenjunga. In fact, all of the world's top 100 peaks are part of these ranges. But that's not all. They also contain some of the world's greatest glaciers. And these glaciers feed some of the mightiest rivers: the Ganga, Brahmaputra, Indus, Mekong, Yangtze, and others. All of them are fed by the Hindu Kush Himalayas, and in turn, these rivers help feed and sustain billions. Around 2 billion people across Asia depend on these rivers. And all these people, making a quarter of the human race, are in danger. Because the life-giving glaciers of the Himalayas are melting at an unprecedented rate. The International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, or ICIMOD, in Nepal has released a report. It says that Hindu Kush Himalayan glaciers could lose 75% of their ice by the year 2100. And this is not something that can be fixed later.
Some of these changes, glacier melt, this decline in snow cover, these are irreversible. Once the glaciers are gone, it's gone.
Why is this happening? Global warming, of course. When measuring human-made climate change, we follow a base measure, the average global temperature before the Industrial Revolution. The world is currently set to get 3 degrees Celsius hotter than pre-industrial levels. This will be by 2100. Now, 3 degrees Celsius may not sound apocalyptic, but that's the global average temperature change. Some areas will heat up more than others, and fragile ecosystems like the Hindu Kush Himalayas will be worse affected. In fact, the effects of global warming are already showing. According to the ICI MOD, Himalayan glaciers melted 60% faster since 2010 than in the previous decade.
But looking at the data from satellites, we can see just from 2000 and 2009 and then to the following decade, there was a significant increase, over 60% increase in the glacier melt. And that's huge in just 10 years. And this is going to have really big consequences.
60% faster in just a decade. And the effects are visible to all who go there.
Before we used to melt the ice from the glacier for drinking water. We still drink water, but from that is already melted and collected in ponds.
These ponds he's talking about eventually become glacial lakes, and when they form quickly, they are unstable. This leads to them bursting and sending a destructive torrent of water downstream. One of the worst examples of this is from India. In 2013, a glacial lake burst and flooded the town of Kedarnath. Thousands were killed in the pilgrimage site. Disasters like that will become more common as the Himalayan glaciers rapidly melt. And that's until the glacial waters are around. Once they get depleted, the rivers will start drying up. Mighty rivers like the Ganga, Brahmaputra, Mekong and Yangtze will all start to dwindle. This will affect the lives and livelihoods of 2 billion people. 1/4 of the human race. It's a disaster of uncomparable magnitude just waiting to happen. Before it does, governments around the world need to wake up. They cannot take climate change lightly. They need to aggressively move towards sustainable climate goals. If not, they will be a reason for unparalleled human suffering in the years to come.
And now it's time for Vantage shots, images that tell the story. A submarine that went to explore the Titanic wreckage has gone missing. A British billionaire is one of the tourists on board. The US and Canada have launched a search operation. In the US, Kilauea, the second largest volcano in Hawaii, is erupting again. And a massive fire broke out in Germany's largest amusement park. And finally, what makes the 20th of June significant? We're taking you back in history. On this day in 2001, General Pervez Musharraf declared himself as Pakistan's president. He replaced the country's president, Rafiq Tarar. This happened 2 years after Musharraf seized power for Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif in a military coup. We're leaving you with that. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow from here, Washington, D.C.
And oneness of Allah, that there can be no prophet, there can be no prophet.
Thank you.